I sold my farm to pay off my daughter's mortgage. When I finished the payment, my unemployed son-in-law said, "Great, now you can live in the garage." My daughter agreed. "You never showed affection." Then I read a document that made them go pale. "I'm glad to have you here." Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought I'd end up here, standing in what used to be my own driveway, holding a single suitcase, staring at the garage where my daughter just told me I'd be living from now on. The morning had started like any other. I'd driven over to Sophia's house with the final bank documents, my hands shaking slightly as I held the papers that confirmed what I'd done. Sold my father's farm. The 100-acre property that had been in our family for 3 generations, gone. All of it converted into cold, hard cash to pay off the mortgage on my daughter's suburban dream home. "Dad, you made it!" Sophia had greeted me at the door, but something felt different. Her smile seemed forced, like she was performing rather than feeling genuine happiness. Behind her, I could see Robert lounging on the couch I'd helped them pick out 2 years ago, still in his pajamas even though it was past noon. "I have the papers," I said, patting the envelope in my jacket pocket. "The mortgage is completely paid off. You don't owe the bank a single penny anymore." I expected tears of relief, maybe a hug. Instead, Sophia's expression shifted to something I couldn't quite read. She glanced back at Robert, who was now paying attention to our conversation. That's great, Dad," she said, but her voice sounded flat. "Come in, let's talk." The living room felt colder than usual, despite the August heat outside. Robert finally stood up, running his hands through his unwashed hair. He'd been unemployed for 8 months now, but every time I asked about his job search, Sophia would jump in with excuses. "He's being selective," she'd say. "He's waiting for the right opportunity." "So it's done?" Robert asked, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. "The house is free and clear?" I nodded, pulling out the documents. "Every penny paid. Sophia, you and the kids will never have to worry about losing this place." That's when Robert smiled, and something cold settled in my stomach. It wasn't a grateful smile. It was the smile of someone who'd just won something. "Perfect," he said, clapping his hands together. "That makes this so much easier." "Makes what easier?" I asked, looking between him and my daughter. Sophia shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my eyes. "Dad, we need to talk about your living situation." "My living situation?" Robert stepped forward, suddenly animated. "Look, Henry, here's the thing. This house is ours now, free and clear, just like you said. But it's not really set up for 3 adults, you know. We've got the kids to think about and space is tight." I felt my chest tighten. "I don't understand." "The garage," Sophia said quickly, her words tumbling out. "We cleaned it out and there's electricity out there. We set up a space heater and everything. It's actually quite cozy." "The garage. They wanted me to live in the garage." I stared at my daughter, this woman I'd raised from birth after her mother died when she was only 6. The little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who I'd taught to ride a bike in the very driveway where I was now standing. The young woman I'd worked double shifts to put through college, who I'd walked down the aisle just 4 years ago. "Sophia," I said slowly, "are you asking me to live in your garage?" "It's temporary," she said, but she still wouldn't meet my eyes. "Just until you figure things out." "Figure things out?" My voice was rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I just sold my home to save yours. What exactly am I supposed to figure out?" Robert laughed, actually laughed. "Come on, Henry. You didn't think you were going to live here permanently, did you? I mean, we're married adults. We need our space." The words hit me like a physical blow. I looked at Sophia, waiting for her to defend me, to tell her husband he was being cruel. Instead, she crossed her arms and said the words that would haunt me for the rest of my life. "Dad, you never really showed me much affection growing up anyway. You were always working, always distant. At least this way, we'll see more of each other." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the neighbor's dog barking, a lawnmower in the distance, the normal sounds of suburban life continuing while my world collapsed. Never showed affection. I thought about the countless nights I'd stayed up with her when she was sick, reading her stories until my voice gave out, the way I'd coached her soccer team for 3 years because she begged me to, the college fund I'd started when she was born, working overtime every weekend to make sure she could pursue any dreams she wanted. "I worked to provide for you, I managed to say. After your mother died, I did everything I could to make sure you had a good life. Work, 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 Sophia said, her voice taking on a bitter tone I'd never heard before. That's all you ever cared about. Robert says that's probably why Mom got sick. All the stress of being married to someone so emotionally unavailable. Robert nodded sagely, as if he'd made some profound observation. A lot of wives develop health problems when they're not getting the emotional support they need from their husbands. The accusation that I was somehow responsible for my wife's cancer diagnosis, that my love for my family had somehow caused the disease that tore our world apart, made my vision blur with rage. But looking at Sophia's face, I could see she believed it. This man, this unemployed leech who'd been living off my daughter's inheritance and now my sacrifice, had poisoned her against me. "Show me the garage," I said quietly. They led me through the backyard to the small structure that had once housed garden tools and Christmas decorations. Robert had indeed cleared it out, but calling it cozy was generous. A single mattress lay on the concrete floor, with a small space heater plugged into the wall. A card table held a hot plate and a miniature refrigerator that hummed loudly. "See?" Sophia said, trying to inject enthusiasm into her voice. "It's like a studio apartment." I set my suitcase down on the concrete and turned to face them both. "How long?" "How long what?" Robert asked. "How long have you been planning this?" They exchanged a look, and I had my answer. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision made after seeing the paid-off mortgage papers. They'd been planning to stick me in the garage all along. The worst part wasn't the garage itself. It was the realization that my daughter, the child I'd devoted my life to raising, saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed. And the man she'd married, the man I'd welcomed into our family, viewed me as a problem he'd finally solved. As they walked back toward the house, leaving me alone with my single suitcase and the sounds of their muffled conversation drifting through the windows, I wondered how everything had gone so wrong. But what I didn't know yet was that in the pocket of my jacket, folded among the mortgage papers, was a document that would change everything. I just hadn't found it yet. That first night in the garage, I barely slept. The concrete floor was hard beneath the thin mattress, and every sound from the house seemed amplified in the darkness. I could hear Robert's television, the running water from their shower, the ordinary sounds of people living comfortably while I lay in what amounted to a storage room. But what kept me awake wasn't the discomfort. It was Sophia's words echoing in my mind. "You never really showed me much affection growing up anyway." I stared at the ceiling, remembering the night Linda died. Sophia was only 6, standing in the hospital hallway in her favorite purple pajamas because I'd grabbed her from bed when the call came. The doctors had been kind but direct. The cancer had spread faster than anyone expected. We had hours, maybe less. "Where's Mommy?" Sophia had asked, her small hand gripping mine so tightly I could feel her tiny fingernails digging into my palm. "Mommy's very sick, sweetheart," I'd whispered, kneeling down to her level. "But she loves you so much and she wants to see you." For the next 3 hours, until Linda took her last breath, I held Sophia on my lap while she talked to her mother. I brushed her hair when it got tangled, wiped her tears when she cried, and promised her over and over that I would never leave her alone. How was keeping that promise not showing affection? The next morning, I was awakened by voices drifting through the thin garage walls. Robert and Sophia were in the kitchen, and their conversation made my blood run cold. "I still think we should have waited a few more weeks," Sophia was saying. He seemed so shocked. "Look, babe, we needed to move fast," Robert replied. "Once that mortgage was paid off, we had to establish the new dynamic right away. If we let him get comfortable in the house, it would have been harder to transition him out." "Transition him out?" I sat up on the mattress, straining to hear better. "Besides," Robert continued, "your dad's loaded. He's got retirement savings, Social Security, probably life insurance. This garage thing is just temporary until he realizes he needs to contribute more to the household." "What do you mean, contribute more?" "Think about it, Sophia. He's living here rent-free, using our electricity, our water. The least he can do is help with groceries, utilities, maybe even give us a monthly payment for the privilege of staying on our property." Our property. The word stung, but what followed was worse. "You're right," Sophia said. "He should be grateful we're even letting him stay. Most people his age would be in a nursing home by now." I was 63 years old, in perfect health, and had just liquidated my life savings to save their house. The idea that I should be grateful for the privilege of living in their garage while paying them rent was so absurd it would have been laughable if it wasn't my reality. But it was Robert's next words that revealed the true scope of their manipulation. "The key is making him think this was his choice," Robert said. "If he feels guilty about being a burden, he'll be more willing to contribute financially. And if he gets too comfortable or starts demanding better treatment, we can always remind him about how emotionally distant he was when you were growing up." "That was genius, by the way," Sophia said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Bringing up Mom's cancer like that. The look on his face when you suggested he might have caused it." They laughed. Both of them laughed about using my dead wife's memory as a weapon against me. I sat on that mattress, hands shaking with rage, as the full picture became clear. This hadn't been a spontaneous decision made after I paid off their mortgage. They'd been planning this for months, maybe longer. Robert had systematically poisoned Sophia against me, rewriting our family history and convincing her that my sacrifices were actually signs of neglect. The sound of footsteps approaching the garage sent me scrambling back under the thin blanket, pretending to sleep. The door opened with a creak. "Dad?" Sophia's voice was artificially sweet. "Are you awake?" I opened my eyes, forcing myself to appear groggy. "What time is it?" "Almost 9. Robert and I were thinking maybe you could help out with some things around the house today. You know, since you're staying here and all." "What kind of things?" She handed me a handwritten list. "Mow the lawn, clean the gutters, wash both cars, trim the hedges, paint the back fence." It was a full day's worth of manual labor, the kind of honey-do list that Robert should have been tackling during his 8 months of unemployment. "These are chores for Robert," I said, handing the list back. Sophia's expression hardened. "Robert is busy today." "Busy. He has some important phone calls to make about job opportunities." Through the garage window, I could see Robert in the living room, controller in hand, playing video games on the television I'd helped them buy. "Sophia," I said carefully, "we need to talk about what's happening here." "What do you mean?" "I sold my home to save yours. I gave up everything I had to keep you from losing this house, and now you're treating me like hired help." Her face shifted, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the little girl I'd raised. But then her expression hardened again, and I knew Robert's influence had won. "Dad, nobody forced you to sell the farm. You made that choice, and nobody's forcing you to stay here either. If you don't like the arrangement, you're free to leave. Leave to go where? I don't have a home anymore. I sold it for you. That's not my problem," she said, but her voice wavered slightly. "You're a grown man. Figure it out." After she left, I sat alone in that garage, staring at the list of chores and thinking about how completely my life had been turned upside down. My daughter, the person I loved most in the world, had been systematically turned against me by a manipulative man who saw me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. But as I reached into my jacket to get my reading glasses, my fingers brushed against the envelope of papers from the bank. There were more documents in there than I remembered, and as I pulled them out to examine them more carefully, one paper in particular caught my attention. It was an old deed, yellowed with age, that had been mixed in with the mortgage documents. I recognized my father's signature at the bottom, but the property description made my heart stop. The land that Sophia's house was built on wasn't just similar to part of my father's original property. According to this deed, it was exactly the same parcel that had been split off from the main farm decades ago, but never officially transferred out of the family name. My hands trembled as I read the legal description again, comparing it to Sophia's property boundaries. There was no mistake. Due to some long-forgotten paperwork error, Sophia's house was built on land that technically still belonged to me. And neither she nor Robert had any idea. I spent the entire weekend studying that deed, cross-referencing it with every document I could find in the boxes I'd brought from the farm. The more I researched, the clearer the picture became, and the more my hands shook with a mixture of disbelief and something that felt dangerously close to hope. My father had split the farm into parcels back in 1987, intending to sell off the smaller sections to help with some financial difficulties. The parcel where Sophia's house now sat had been surveyed and prepared for sale, but the buyer had backed out at the last minute. In all the confusion that followed, the deed transfer was never completed, and the land remained legally tied to the main property. When I sold the farm to pay Sophia's mortgage, I'd assumed I was selling everything my father owned. But this 2-acre parcel had somehow slipped through the cracks of bureaucracy and remained in the original family trust, which meant it now belonged to me as the sole surviving heir. The implications were staggering. Sophia and Robert didn't own the land their house sat on. Technically, they were living on my property without permission, but I needed to be absolutely certain before I did anything. Monday morning, while Robert was sleeping off what appeared to be a substantial hangover, and Sophia was at her part-time job at the boutique, I drove to the county clerk's office. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and infinite patience, helped me trace the property records back 40 years. Every document confirmed what I'd suspected. The original deed had never been properly transferred, and through a series of bureaucratic oversights, the land had remained tied to my father's estate. "This is quite unusual," the clerk said, adjusting her glasses as she studied the records. "Normally, these kinds of discrepancies are caught during the title search when someone applies for a mortgage." What would have happened if they had been caught? Well, the mortgage company would have required clear title before approving the loan. Your daughter would have had to get you to sign off on the transfer, or the sale couldn't have gone through. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. If the title company had done their job properly, Sophia would have been forced to involve me in the property transaction from the beginning. Instead, she'd been able to take out a mortgage on land she didn't legally own, and I'd been able to pay off that mortgage without realizing I was essentially paying off a loan secured by my own property. "What are my options?" I asked. The clerk pulled out a form. "You could file a quiet title action to establish clear ownership. Given the documentation you have, it would likely be straightforward. The question is whether you want to pursue it." I thanked her and drove back to the house, my mind racing. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had leverage. Real, legal, documented leverage that Robert and Sophia knew nothing about. But I wasn't ready to play that card yet. First, I wanted to understand exactly how deep their manipulation went. That evening, I pretended to be asleep when I heard them talking in the kitchen again. Their voices carried clearly through the thin garage walls, and what I heard made my stomach turn. "He did all the yard work without complaining," Sophia was saying. "Maybe this is working better than we thought." "I told you it would," Robert replied. "Guilty people are easy to control. We just have to keep reinforcing the narrative that he owes us for all those years of emotional neglect." "Do you think he'll start paying rent soon?" "Give it another week or two. Once he realizes this is permanent, he'll start offering money just to make us happy. Guilty parents always do." There was a pause, then Sophia's voice again, quieter this time. "Sometimes I feel bad about what we're doing." My heart jumped. Maybe there was still some part of my daughter left, some piece of the little girl who used to bring me dandelions from the yard and call them sunshine flowers. "Babe," Robert's voice was firm, almost commanding. "Remember what we talked about. Your dad chose work over family for 20 years. He chose money over emotional connection. Now that he's old and needs support, he expects you to just forget all of that and take care of him. That's not fair to you." "You're right," Sophia said, but she didn't sound entirely convinced. "Besides, think about our future. The kids' college funds, our retirement, maybe even a vacation home someday. Your dad has plenty of money sitting in retirement accounts. A little guilt-induced generosity would go a long way toward securing our financial future." "How much do you think he has saved?" "Based on his lifestyle and the fact that he was able to pay off our mortgage in cash, probably at least a couple $100,000, maybe more. If we play this right, we could be set for life." I closed my eyes, feeling sick. They weren't just planning to exploit me emotionally and physically. They were planning to systematically drain my life savings, using guilt and manipulation to convince me to hand over my retirement security. The conversation continued, but I'd heard enough. I lay there in the darkness, thinking about the deed in my jacket pocket and the power it represented. Tomorrow, I would call the lawyer who had helped me with the farm sale and ask him to research my options more thoroughly. But tonight, I wanted to remember my daughter as she used to be. I thought about the Christmas when she was 8, after we'd been struggling financially for months following Linda's medical bills. I'd worked overtime every day for 2 months to afford the bicycle she'd been wanting, and when she saw it under the tree, she'd cried and thrown her arms around me, telling me I was the best daddy in the world. I thought about her high school graduation, when she'd thanked me in her speech for working so hard to give her opportunities. She'd said that watching me pursue my goals had taught her that anything was possible with enough determination. I thought about her wedding day, when she'd danced with me and whispered in my ear that she hoped her marriage would be as strong as the love I'd shown her growing up. Where had that girl gone? When had Robert's poison taken root so completely that she could forget 20 years of love and sacrifice? But even as I grieved for the daughter I'd lost, I felt something else growing inside me. Not quite anger, not quite hope, but something harder and more determined. They thought they had all the power in this situation. They thought I was a broken old man with no options and no fight left in him. They thought they could manipulate and exploit me indefinitely, taking my money and my dignity while convincing me I deserved it. They were wrong. The deed in my jacket pocket proved that I wasn't as powerless as they believed. And tomorrow, I would start figuring out exactly how to use that power. But I would be patient. I would be smart. And when the time came to reveal what I knew, I would make sure they understood exactly what they had thrown away when they decided to treat their father and benefactor like a servant. The little girl who used to call dandelions sunshine flowers might be gone, but I wasn't ready to give up on the possibility that she might still be buried somewhere underneath Robert's influence. And if she wasn't, well, I had other options now. Tuesday morning, I told Sophia I had a doctor's appointment and needed to borrow her car. The lie came easier than I expected, but then again, I was learning that survival sometimes required deception. "Just make sure you're back by 3, she said, not looking up from her phone. "Robert needs you to power wash the driveway today." I nodded and left without pointing out that Robert was perfectly capable of power washing his own driveway, assuming he could tear himself away from his video games long enough to do it. James Morrison had been my lawyer for 15 years, handling everything from Linda's estate to the farm sale. His office was in an old brick building downtown, with the kind of heavy wooden furniture that suggested both stability and expense. When I walked in carrying my folder of documents, his secretary immediately ushered me into his office. "Henry," James said, standing to shake my hand. "Good to see you. How are you settling in with Sophia and Robert?" The question was innocent enough, but something in his tone suggested he might already suspect all wasn't well. James had known my family for years, had watched Sophia grow up, and had handled Linda's will when she died. "That's actually what I need to talk to you about," I said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. I laid out the entire situation, from the garage living arrangement to the overheard conversations about draining my retirement savings. James listened without interruption, his expression growing darker as the story unfolded. When I pulled out the deed, his eyebrows shot up. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, studying the document. "How did the title company miss this?" "That's what I was hoping you could tell me." James pulled out his laptop and started typing. "Let me check the public records to confirm what you found." His fingers flew across the keyboard for several minutes. Then he leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "Henry, this is extraordinary. The deed is absolutely valid, and you're right about the ownership issue. Your daughter's house is built on land that legally belongs to you. The title company that handled her mortgage should have caught this, and frankly, they're probably liable for the oversight. What does that mean for me?" "It means you have several options, none of them simple." James pulled out a legal pad and started making notes. "First, you could file a quiet title action to establish clear legal ownership. That's pretty straightforward given the documentation you have. And then what? Then you'd legally own the land their house sits on. You could charge them rent, you could sell the land to them, or," he paused, looking at me carefully, "you could evict them." The word hung in the air between us. Evict. I could actually evict my own daughter from the house I'd just saved from foreclosure. "There's another option," James continued. "You could use this as leverage to negotiate better treatment. Essentially, you'd be in a position to dictate the terms of your living arrangement." "What would you recommend?" James leaned back in his chair, studying me. "Honestly, I'd recommend you get out of that situation entirely. What they're doing to you isn't just cruel, it's abusive. You don't owe them anything, Henry. You paid off their mortgage, and instead of gratitude, they're treating you like a servant. She's still my daughter. And you're still her father, but that doesn't give her the right to exploit you." His voice was firm. "Henry, I've seen this before. Adult children who view their elderly parents as a resource to be managed rather than people to be respected. It rarely gets better on its own." I sat quietly for a moment, thinking about the little girl who used to crawl into my lap when she was scared. What if I gave them one more chance? Use the deed as leverage to demand better treatment, but didn't immediately throw them out? "You could do that," James said slowly. "But you'd need to be prepared for the possibility that they'll refuse to change. And frankly, based on what you've told me about Robert's influence, I'm not optimistic about their willingness to reform. What would the process look like if I decided to pursue the property claim? James outlined the legal steps involved. Filing the quiet title action would take about 60 days, during which time I'd need to provide proper notice to all interested parties. The court would review the evidence, and assuming no one could produce documentation showing the land had been properly transferred, I'd be awarded clear title. The strongest part of your case, James said, is that they took out a mortgage on property they didn't own. That's technically fraud, even if it was unintentional. The bank could potentially demand immediate repayment of the entire loan, which I just paid off. Exactly. So you paid off a fraudulent mortgage on your own land. That gives you even more legal standing. As we talked through the details, I found myself thinking about the power dynamics in that house. Robert treated me like an inconvenience because he thought I had no options. Sophia went along with his abuse because she believed I deserved it. But what would happen when they realized I held all the legal cards? There's something else you should consider, James said as our meeting wound down. If you decide to pursue this, you need to be prepared for the relationship with your daughter to be permanently damaged. This kind of legal action tends to burn bridges. The relationship is already damaged. The question is whether it can be repaired, and if it can't. I thought about the conversation I'd overheard the night before, about their plans to systematically drain my retirement savings. I thought about Robert's laughter when he described manipulating me with guilt about Linda's death. I thought about the list of manual labor they expected me to perform while paying them rent for the privilege of living in their garage. If it can't be repaired, I said slowly, then at least I'll have my dignity back. James nodded. I'll start preparing the paperwork. We can file whenever you're ready. Driving back to the house, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks: control. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had options. Real options that didn't involve accepting abuse or manipulation. When I arrived home, Robert was waiting for me in the driveway, arms crossed and wearing an expression of theatrical annoyance. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded. "I told Sophia you needed to power wash the driveway today." I looked at him standing there in his stained sweatpants and wrinkled t-shirt, this unemployed man-child who thought he had the authority to issue me orders, and I felt something shift inside me. "I had an appointment," I said calmly. "What kind of appointment?" "The kind that's none of your business." Robert's eyes narrowed. "Listen, old man, I don't know what kind of attitude you think you can cop, but let me remind you of something. You're living in our garage out of the goodness of our hearts. If you don't like the arrangements, you're free to find somewhere else to live." "Our garage," I repeated. "That's right. Our house, our garage, our rules." I looked at the house behind him, the house built on land that legally belonged to me, the house whose mortgage I'd just paid off with the proceeds from selling my family farm. Then I looked back at Robert, this parasite who'd convinced my daughter that I deserved to be treated like hired help. "Is that what you think?" I asked. "That's what I know." I nodded slowly, then reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the deed. I didn't unfold it or show it to him. I just held it in my hand, feeling its weight. "You know what, Robert? You're absolutely right. This is your house and these are your rules." He looked confused by my sudden agreement, but satisfied that he'd reasserted his dominance. "I'm glad we understand each other," he said. "Oh, we understand each other perfectly," I replied. I think it's time I had a conversation with Sophia about that understanding. As I walked toward the garage, I could feel Robert watching me, probably wondering why I seemed so calm after his attempt at intimidation. He had no idea that everything was about to change. Tomorrow, I would call James and tell him to file the paperwork. Tonight, I would sleep in that garage one last time as a powerless victim. But I wouldn't be powerless much longer. I waited 3 days for the legal papers to be filed before I made my move. 3 days of pretending to be the broken old man they thought I was, completing their ridiculous chore lists and listening to their increasingly bold discussions about my finances. On Friday morning, James called to confirm that the quiet title action had been officially filed and that Robert and Sophia would be served with papers within the next 24 hours. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked one last time. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." That evening, I asked Sophia if we could have a family meeting. She looked surprised but agreed, probably assuming I was finally ready to discuss contributing rent money or taking on additional household responsibilities. Robert should be part of this conversation too, I said. She called him from the living room, where he'd been playing video games since noon. He appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing the same clothes he'd had on for 3 days, looking annoyed at being interrupted. "What's this about?" he asked, slumping into a chair. I remained standing, positioning myself where I could see both of their faces clearly. "It's about our living arrangement and some new information that's come to light." Sophia leaned forward, suddenly interested. "New information?" I pulled out the deed and placed it on the kitchen table between us. "This is the original deed to the land your house is built on. It was mixed in with the papers from the bank when I paid off your mortgage." Robert barely glanced at it. So it turns out that due to a paperwork error that happened decades ago, this land was never properly transferred out of my father's estate, which means it legally belongs to me. The change in the room was immediate. Sophia's face went pale, and Robert suddenly sat up straighter, his dismissive attitude evaporating. "What are you talking about?" Sophia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm talking about the fact that your house is built on property that I own. The title company missed it when you applied for your mortgage, which means you've been paying off a loan secured by land you don't actually have legal title to." Robert snatched the deed from the table, his eyes scanning the document frantically. "This is bullshit. This has to be some kind of mistake." "I thought so too, which is why I had my lawyer research it thoroughly. The deed is valid and the property records confirm it. You've been living on my land without permission." Sophia stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "Dad, this is crazy. You can't just... we live here. This is our home." "A home that I just paid the mortgage on," I said calmly. "A home built on land that belongs to me." Robert's face had turned red, and I could see the wheels turning in his head as he tried to figure out how to regain control of the situation. "You can't prove this. One old piece of paper doesn't mean anything. Actually, it means everything. My lawyer has already filed a quiet title action with the court. You'll both be served with papers tomorrow morning." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched as the reality of their situation began to sink in. For months they'd held all the power, dictating where I lived, how I spent my time, and what contributions they expected from me. Now, suddenly, they were the ones without legal standing. "What do you want?" Sophia asked finally, her voice shaking. "What do I want?" I repeated the question, letting it hang in the air. "What I want is to understand how my own daughter could treat me the way you have. What I want is to know when you decided that the man who raised you, who worked himself to exhaustion to provide for you, who sold everything he owned to save your home, deserved to live in a garage and be treated like hired help." Tears started streaming down Sophia's face. "Dad, I'm sorry. We didn't mean for it to be like this." "Yes, you did." My voice was steady, but there was steel underneath it. "I heard you talking, Sophia, both of you. I heard Robert explain how he was manipulating me with guilt about your mother's death. I heard you laugh about it. I heard you planning to systematically drain my retirement savings." Robert jumped up from his chair. "You were spying on us? I was lying in the garage you stuck me in, listening to you discuss how to exploit me further. The walls are thin, Robert, very thin." "Dad, please," Sophia said, reaching for my arm. "We can work this out. We can make changes." I looked at her hand on my arm, remembering all the times I'd held that same hand when she was scared or hurt or needed comfort. But this wasn't my little girl anymore. This was a woman who'd allowed her husband to poison her against her own father. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, gently removing her hand from my arm. "You have 30 days to decide what you want to do. You can buy the land from me at fair market value, which my lawyer estimates to be about $200,000. You can pay me rent to continue living here, or you can find somewhere else to live." "200,000? Robert's voice cracked. "We don't have that kind of money." "Then I suggest you consider the rental option." "How much rent?" Sophia asked quietly. "Market rate for a 2-acre lot in this neighborhood would be about $3,000 a month." Robert exploded. "3,000? That's insane. We can't afford that." "Then perhaps you should consider getting a job," I said, looking directly at him. "It's been 8 months, Robert. 8 months of unemployment while you've been living off my daughter's part-time income and my financial support. I've been looking. You've been playing video games and planning how to exploit me. There's a difference." Sophia sank back into her chair, her face in her hands. "Dad, please. We made mistakes, but we're family. Families work things out. Families treat each other with respect, Sophia. Families don't manipulate each other with lies about dead spouses. Families don't force their elderly parents to live in garages while demanding free labor. We'll change, she said desperately. We'll treat you better. You can have the guest room, and we'll stop asking you to do chores, and Robert will get a job. I looked at Robert, who was glaring at me with undisguised hatred. Is that right, Robert? Are you going to get a job? I'll do whatever it takes, he said through gritted teeth, but his eyes promised retaliation. No, I said quietly. You won't, because you're not capable of change, Robert. You're a manipulator and a parasite, and the only reason you're agreeing to anything now is because you've lost your leverage over me. I turned back to Sophia. And you've allowed him to turn you into someone I don't recognize. The daughter I raised would never have treated anyone the way you've treated me, let alone her own father. Dad, please don't do this, she whispered. I'm not doing anything, Sophia. I'm simply reclaiming what's legally mine and giving you choices. What you do with those choices is up to you. Robert stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is blackmail. No, Robert. Blackmail is what you and Sophia have been doing to me, using guilt and manipulation to control my behavior. This is justice. If you do this, you'll lose your daughter forever, he said, his voice low and threatening. I looked at Sophia, still sitting with her face in her hands, crying softly. I lost my daughter the day she decided to treat me like a burden instead of her father. The question now is whether she's willing to earn back the relationship we used to have. I walked toward the garage, then turned back. You have 30 days to make your decision. My lawyer will be in touch with the details. As I closed the garage door behind me, I could hear them arguing in raised voices. Robert was furious, probably already planning some kind of retaliation. Sophia was crying, finally understanding the magnitude of what they'd done. But for the first time in weeks, I wasn't the one feeling powerless. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tonight I would sleep peacefully, knowing that I'd finally stopped being a victim and started being a man who demanded the respect he deserved. The little girl who used to call dandelions sunshine flowers might be gone forever, but at least now she would have to choose between her father and the man who'd turned her against him. And whatever choice she made, I would finally be free. The 30 days that followed were the longest of my life, but also the most liberating. I moved out of the garage the morning after our confrontation, renting a small apartment across town while the legal proceedings moved forward. James had been right about the strength of my case. The court awarded me clear title to the property within 3 weeks, and suddenly Robert and Sophia found themselves in the position of being tenants on land they'd never owned. The first week after I moved out, Sophia called me every day, sometimes multiple times. Her messages started angry, then became pleading, then desperate. Robert, meanwhile, had apparently decided that the best strategy was to ignore the situation entirely, as if pretending it wasn't happening would make it go away. Dad, please, Sophia said during one particularly difficult phone call. We're family. We can work this out without lawyers and courts and all this legal stuff. We're family when it's convenient for you, I replied. When you needed your mortgage paid, we were family. When you needed free labor and were planning to drain my retirement savings, we were family. But when I needed basic respect and dignity, suddenly I was just a burden to be managed. I know we made mistakes, but Robert's really trying to change. He's been looking for work every day. I didn't point out that Robert had been looking for work for 8 months before this crisis hit. Some conversations weren't worth having anymore. The breakthrough came on day 23. I was having coffee in my small apartment kitchen when I heard a knock at my door. When I opened it, Sophia stood there alone, her eyes red from crying. "Can I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside and let her enter. She looked around the sparse one-bedroom apartment, taking in the single chair, the card table that served as both desk and dining room, the mattress on the floor that I'd been sleeping on. "Dad, this is awful. You shouldn't be living like this. It's clean, it's quiet, and nobody here treats me like a servant. I've lived in worse places." She sat down heavily in the single chair, and for a moment she looked exactly like the little girl she used to be when she was in trouble and knew it. "I left him," she said quietly. I set my coffee cup down and looked at her carefully. "What?" "I left Robert yesterday. I took the kids and went to stay with my friend Jennifer. I can't do this anymore, Dad. I can't keep pretending that what we did to you was okay. What changed your mind?" She was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands. "A lot of things, but mostly it was watching how he reacted when he found out about the deed. He wasn't upset that we'd hurt you or that we might lose our home. He was angry that his plan to control you had been ruined, and that surprised you. It should have, but it didn't, and that's when I realized how much I'd changed, how much I'd let him change me. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. Dad, I don't know how to apologize for what I did to you. I don't know how to make up for treating you like that. I sat down on the edge of the mattress, studying my daughter's face. Why did you believe him when he said I was emotionally distant when you were growing up? Because I wanted to believe it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Because it was easier than admitting that I'd become selfish and entitled. Robert made it sound like I deserved better treatment from you, like I was owed something for all those years you worked so much. I worked so much because your mother was gone and I was trying to be both parents to you. I know that now. I think I knew it then too. But Robert made it seem like working to provide for me was somehow a failure of love instead of an expression of it. We sat in silence for several minutes. Outside, I could hear children playing in the courtyard, their laughter drifting through the thin walls. What happens now? Sophia asked finally. That depends on what you want to happen. I want my dad back, she said simply. I want to be the daughter you raised me to be, instead of the person Robert turned me into. And Robert? Robert can figure out his own life. I'm done being manipulated, and I'm done letting him manipulate my relationship with you. I looked at this woman, my daughter, who had caused me so much pain, but who was also the little girl I'd loved more than my own life. The choice I'd hoped she would make was finally being offered, but I needed to be sure it was real. If we rebuild our relationship, I said carefully, it has to be different than before. I won't be your emergency bank account or your free labor force. I won't tolerate being taken for granted again. I understand. And I won't tolerate Robert in my life at all. If you reconcile with him, you choose him over me. There's no middle ground. I don't want to reconcile with him. I want to divorce him. And that's going to be complicated. You'll need to find somewhere to live, probably get a better job, figure out custody arrangements for the kids. I know, it's going to be hard, but it's the right thing to do. I made a decision that surprised even me. The house is yours. What? I'm signing the deed over to you. The house and the land. All of it. Sophia stared at me. Dad, I can't accept that. Not after what I did to you. You can, and you will. But with conditions. What conditions? Robert's name comes off everything. The deed, any remaining paperwork, all of it. If you divorce him, he gets nothing from the property settlement related to the house. But Dad, that house is worth more than $500,000. I can't just take that from you. You're not taking it. I'm giving it to you. But I'm giving it to my daughter, not to Robert's wife. There's a difference. She started crying again. But this time the tears seemed different. Relieved, maybe, or grateful. There's one more condition, I said. What? I want a relationship with my grandchildren that doesn't go through you or anyone else. If I want to see them, if I want to take them somewhere or have them spend the night, that's between me and them. You don't get to use access to my grandchildren as a bargaining chip ever again. I never did that. You did it by putting me in the garage and letting Robert treat me like dirt in front of them. Children learn what they see, Sophia. If you let them see their grandfather being disrespected, you teach them that disrespecting elderly people is acceptable. She nodded, wiping her eyes. You're right. I didn't think about what we were teaching them. Do you accept my conditions? Yes. All of them. 6 months later, I was helping Sophia plant tomatoes in the garden behind the house that was now legally hers. Her divorce from Robert had been finalized the month before, and while it had been ugly and expensive, she'd emerged from it stronger and more independent than I'd seen her in years. Robert, meanwhile, had moved back in with his parents and was reportedly working at a grocery store while trying to get his life back together. He'd made several attempts to contact Sophia, promising to change and begging for another chance, but she'd blocked his number and refused to engage. Do you ever regret it? I asked as we worked side by side in the afternoon sun. Regret what? Leaving him, starting over. It hasn't been easy for you. Sophia sat back on her heels, dirt smudged on her cheek, looking more like the girl I remembered than she had in years. The only thing I regret is waiting so long to do it. My granddaughter Emma came running around the corner of the house, her face flushed with excitement. Grandpa, Mom, come see what I found. I stood up, brushing the dirt off my hands, and followed her to whatever discovery awaited us. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. The little girl who used to call dandelions sunshine flowers wasn't gone after all. She'd just been buried under years of someone else's influence. But with patience and the right conditions, even the most damaged relationships could grow back stronger than before. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the consequences of their own choices. And sometimes when those consequences finally arrive, they choose to become the person they were always meant to be. I'd gotten my daughter back, and she'd gotten her father back. As for Robert, he'd gotten exactly what he deserved, the chance to figure out his own life without anyone else to manipulate or exploit. It was, I thought, as Emma dragged me toward her latest treasure, a fair trade for everyone involved. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.